Anime Wong as much as I do. One of the most, right? This is a good crowd on a Saturday to like show some love. My name is Indra Mungal. I'm the director of programs and exhibitions here at OACC, and we're so happy to have you all here. Now, about today's program. Set against the glittering backdrop of Los Angeles during the gin-soaked jazz age and the rise of Hollywood, this book, Not Your China Doll, The Wild and Shimmering Life of Anime Wong, celebrates the first Asian American movie star, bringing an unsung heroine to light and reclaiming her place in cinema history. We welcome Katie Gee Salisbury, who is out here from New York, and she is the author of this book. That her work is Katie's work has appeared in the New York Times, Vanity Fair, The Believer, the Asian American Writers Workshop, and many other places. She was a finalist for the Jerome Hill Artist Fellowship in 2021 and gave the TED Talk as American as Chop Suey. She also writes the newsletter Half Caste Woman, a fifth generation Chinese American woman who's originally from Southern California. We would like to welcome Katie Gee Salisbury to the stage.
Thank you to Indra and OACC for having me today, and also my Uncle Peter, who's sitting in the audience. He made the connection, and really happy to be here, and also to have Eastwind Books selling books. The last time I was here and did an event maybe 7 years ago in their store, and they hosted me even though I didn't have a book to sell, which was so lovely of them. So it's really nice to be back and to see them again. But yeah, I'm excited to speak to all of you about Anime Wong today. So basically, I will give you an overview of her life and career, and then we'll have some time for questions afterwards. So kind of basic outline of Anime Wong. Who was she? She was born Wong Liu-song in 1905 in Los Angeles, and her Chinese name translates loosely to frosted yellow willows. I mean, if you know something about Chinese, you wouldn't normally translate the yellow part. That's her last name, but she had a kind of flair to it. I mean, she was Chinese American. She had to be told what her Chinese name meant. But anyways, that's her Chinese name. She's a daughter of a laundryman, and both of her parents actually were born in Northern California. And so the way I count things, that makes her third generation Chinese American. So it would have been her grandparents who came over during the gold rush. So her family had been here quite a while. And she was the first American-born Asian actor to play a leading role in a Hollywood film. And across her 4-decade career, she worked in all of the different mediums. She started in silent, moved into talkies, she did radio, theater, and then eventually television in the 1950s. So she broke a lot of milestones throughout all of those mediums. So here on the left, we have a photograph of the Wong family, circa 1925. And Anime Wong is actually the young woman who's on the far right, behind her father, Wong Sam-sing. So it was a large family, working class. He ran the laundry. They also lived in the laundry, as many working class families did. They lived where they worked. So you can imagine when she wasn't in school, she was also helping out at the laundry. She knew how all of the different parts of it worked. And around the time that she was growing up in Los Angeles as a little girl, her and her oldest sister, Lulu, who's on the far left here, they were very close in age and close just as two sisters would be. So they often were making deliveries around town. And it just happened that studios in New York and New Jersey at that time had started moving out to Los Angeles because they'd finally realized they could shoot films all year round because of the sunshine and the weather, whereas in New York they had maybe half a year, and then if you had some bad weather show up because they were filming outside, they needed the sunlight. So they're showing up in Los Angeles. This is before you had to get licenses to shoot places. So they were just shooting in the middle of the streets of downtown Los Angeles, and also very often in Chinatown because it was free atmosphere. They didn't have to build a set, they could just show up and start filming. So Anime sees this as a young girl, and she becomes one of the regular onlookers. She's skipping school sometimes to stand around and watch them work, asking a lot of questions. Supposedly, they give her the nickname the curious Chinese child because she's always there. And she's also skipping school to go to the movies. She's saving some of the tip money that she gets from delivering laundry or saving her lunch money and going down to the Nickelodeons and watching the reels play from end to end over and over, and then racing home to basically replay, reenact everything that she's just seen. So by the time, she's 10 or 11, she's decided that she's going to be a movie star. And luckily, she's kind of in the right place at the right time. So on the far left, we have a clipping from the Los Angeles Times, I think 1921. It's one of her earliest interviews. And this kind of becomes a theme you'll see from the headline here, maid of Orient unspoiled by success, dips her ivory hands in suds. So they're always playing up her Orientalness, even though she's American-born. And that's one of the things that comes up so often in the articles about her. They'll describe how she appeared like this Chinese maiden from some 12th century poem, and then she would open her mouth and completely ruin the illusion because she sounded like a flapper, like all the young girls of her era. And that was a common trope that would occur over and over again. And I think partly that was something Anna May Wong worked to do, right? She wanted to subvert their expectations of her because they didn't even know if she spoke English when they looked at her. And she would say, well, why shouldn't I speak English? I'm American born, that's my language. And people tell me when I speak Chinese, I speak with an American accent, which was very true. So she's getting some early attention because she's skipping school and slowly making her way as an extra in various films. And of course, she's getting attention because she's unusual and different. So we see here in the middle a photograph of her at 15 in one of her first big supporting roles in a film called Dinty. And you can also see just how young she looks here compared to some of her later photos. And then at the far right, she's really embracing her flapper persona in that getup a little bit later in her career. But that was really her way of telling people that she's not just what you think she is, right? I'm a flapper, I'm cool, I know all the lingo. So there's two films that are really important in her early career. The first on the left is a film called The Toll of the Sea, which was a Madame Butterfly tale. So it was a story that was pretty stereotypical, I've been told many times. But the thing that made it different was that the people behind it were the scientists at Technicolor. This is the second Technicolor film ever made, and they made it because they wanted to show off their color technology. So they worked with a Hollywood studio to produce it, but unlike other Hollywood studios, their objective was not to have box office names. They needed actors who helped make it look realistic because they wanted the coloring to look natural. And they specifically chose a Chinese story so they could make use of these really beautiful, lush backdrops, the embroidered clothing, antiques, all sorts of things. They wanted to have this really rich texture to it. So they also, unlike many Hollywood studios, were fine with casting Asian actors to play Asian roles, because normally a lot of studios would cast white actors to play them in yellowface. So previously, just to give you a sense of this, previous adaptations of the Madame Butterfly story had been played by Mary Pickford and Norma Talmadge. So it had been done many times. But in this case, the 17-year-old Anna May Wong gets a lucky break, and this is her first leading role. And she knows this, so she really pulls out all the stops and gives this virtuoso performance. She's crying, on cue for the cameras, and it's really beautiful. And, despite the fact that none of the critics were expecting much from this film because it's to show off the technology, and it's a story that's been done a million times. But even so, they were completely caught off guard by her performance. So the New York Times actually gives her a rave review saying that 9 out of 10 times this performance would be botched, and hers is the 10th performance, and she should be seen again and often. I mean, can you imagine being a 17-year-old girl and getting reviewed like that by the New York Times? So of course, a lot of people start to notice her, and one of the people who sees this film is Douglas Fairbanks, who's essentially like one of the biggest people in Hollywood. He's a star, he's also a producer, he has so much money that he now produces his own films. And the next big picture he's going to do is The Thief of Baghdad, which is a huge Arabian Nights blockbuster, and he's looking for an exotic cast. And so he sees Anna May Wong's performance. He sees how talented she is, and he casts her in The Thief of Baghdad for 1924 in what becomes her unlikely breakout role as the Mongolian slave. And you see her here. She's very scantily clad, probably within the whole production, one of the people who's wearing the least amount of clothing, except for Douglas Fairbanks himself, who's bare-chested. But this is a huge film. It's shown all over the world, and it really launches her to international stardom. And she's probably, aside from Douglas Fairbanks, the only other actor who's really remembered from this film. So I'm actually going to play a few scenes from these films and a few of her other early silents. stop there. I know you guys could probably keep watching. That those clips were actually made by a fan, an Anime Wong fan, who also runs a YouTube channel called The Gallery of Anime Wong. So if you want to see more of her films, all of those films are up there, and you can watch them for free. So it's a great resource. But you can get a sense of her magic on screen, right? It's more, you have to know Anime Wong, you have to really watch her films. So she gets launched. Her career is launched by The Thief of Baghdad. She's getting steady work in Hollywood, and around this time, she does another film called The Alaskan, and the cinematographer. Well, maybe second cameraman. First cameraman is James Wong Howe, also a Chinese American. Later, became an Oscar winner, very famous for his craft. So they're the two Chinese cast members or cast and crew members on this production, and it's actually traveling to Canada to shoot. Well, they're not shooting in Alaska because it's harder to get to Alaska, so they're going to shoot in Canada. And so one of the things that happens when they're about to cross the border is that they realize Chinese Americans aren't like other American citizens. They don't have the same rights and status. And technically, they have to have paperwork to prove their identities. And if they don't have that, they can't leave the country. If they leave the country, they won't get back in because they have no way to prove that they have a right to be here. So this is a crisis that the whole crew has to deal with now. And somehow, we don't know the details, but somehow they get it worked out where the two, Chinese part of their crew get the appropriate papers and are allowed to leave the country and go to Canada to shoot the film and come back. So we have papers here. Sure, this was a very rude awakening for Anime Wong, not having realized this, not having traveled out of the country before. But so the papers here on the far left are her identity papers, and they're stamped in Seattle, Washington, because that's where they crossed the border from a boat into Canada. And she was about 19 when this happened. And then the form on the far right, just to give you an example of what it was like to live under the Chinese exclusion laws. So these laws existed because of the Chinese exclusion, which was passed in 1882. It essentially banned nearly all Chinese immigration from the U.S. And so if you already had status here as a Chinese American immigrant, you had to not only hold identity papers, but if you wanted to leave the country, you had to ask for permission and let them know your plans. So Form 430 here on the right is an example of one of the times she had to request permission to leave. And then when you would return, you'd go through an interrogation. They'd ask you all these questions about where you live, what your profession is, who are all your family members, do you recognize this person, do you recognize this person? And, ordinary people had to go through this, so you can imagine if Anime Wong is going through this, what it must have been like for them. Not only is she grappling with what it means to be Chinese American, from a legal standpoint, she's also learning that things are not, she's had this meteoric rise, but things are not quite what they seem. Now that she feels more established in Hollywood, she's getting lots of roles, but they're tending to be a certain type of role, usually a supporting role. Oftentimes she's kind of the floozy, exotic dancing girl, or the kind of treacherous, evil helper, or if she's, just a kind of neutral, like nice little Chinese maiden, she's in the background, and the lead part is being played by a white actress in yellowface. And one of the reasons this starts to happen is because Hollywood is trying to clean up its act. It's had a lot of racy things going on in its films and within Hollywood outside of the films, like some murder cases and things like that. So they're under a lot of pressure from the government not to show things that degrade the culture, and one of those things is miscegenation, is interracial relationships. And they tell Anime Wong, sorry, we can't put you in leading lady roles because if you're opposite a white man, that relationship can never be consummated because it's illegal to marry someone of a different race. So you have to die, or you have this secondary role. So we see here in the far left a photo from across to Singapore, and that's actually her friend Ramon Navarro, a Mexican actor. But yeah, she has a very bit part in that film. And then here in The Chinese Parrot, they're using Anime Wong's image to advertise the film. And this is a lost film, but we do know from reviews that she only appears in the beginning and then she's killed off. So, they knew that she had the power to bring people in to movies, but they weren't willing to give her the screen time to match. And then the far right picture is a publicity still of her and Renee Adoree from a film called Mr. Wu. And Renee is playing the lead in Yellowface. And I think in this particular photo, it says she's teaching her how to read Chinese. There's another version of where she's teaching her how to use chopsticks. And, you know, these were kind of like extra things that she was asked to do just as a bit player. So, you know, she starts to get fed up with this because she knows she's talented. She's getting 500 fan letters a week. Directors are telling her that she's really talented, but they can't do anything about it. They don't have power to put her in the films. So she does this interview in 1928, which I think is really interesting. And basically she says, you know, to tell the truth, I'm Chinese by race and I love Chinese people and things. My only regret is the limitation upon my work, as I can only play Oriental roles or sometimes Indian parts. As you saw, she was playing Tiger Lily in Peter Pan. Hayakawa's stardom, she's referring to Sesu Hayakawa, who is an internationally famous Japanese actor. Hayakawa's stardom failed because he was never allowed to kiss the heroine. The fans wouldn't have stood for it. So he never got to kiss the white women that he played opposite of. And then, you know, her interviewer says, but surely no one objects to seeing an American kiss a pretty little Chinese girl. And she responds, well, not if she is impersonated by an American in Yellowface. And that is what happens to her over and over again. But someday, you know, she hasn't given up hope. She says, someday someone will write a story demanding a real Chinese girl. Then perhaps I'll have my chance. So, you know, she's very determined to make this happen for herself. So she actually gets an offer to make films in Germany. And she's about 23 at this point. And, you know, the farthest away from home she's been is Canada. She doesn't speak a word of German. There's a lot of unknowns. She could leave Hollywood and maybe never come back. Maybe by the time she gets back, they won't employ her anymore. No one remembers who she is. So it's a huge gamble, and she talks to a lot of people. But in the end, she decides that she's going to go because she's always betting on herself. So she and her older sister Lulu is going to go with her as a chaperone, and they take a train across the country, and then they sail from New York to Hamburg. And even, you know, upon arrival off the train, you can see here in this German article, she's greeted, just completely embraced by the German people. They're super excited for her to be there. She's not only a Hollywood star, she's also Chinese American, which, you know, there's all this intrigue and you know, kind of the positive side of racism is that they really see her as this exotic, interesting person, and they're more open to elevating her in ways that Hollywood wasn't. So she goes to UFA, which is the premiere studio in Berlin at the time, and they write a starring film for her. It's called Song. They've actually renamed it in honor of her Chinese name, Wong Liu Song. So we see it here on the far right. It premieres in the summer of 1928. She gets a standing ovation for 20 minutes. And is mobbed by the crowd afterwards, and later recounts that she felt like it was an out-of-body experience. So she kind of becomes this overnight sensation in Germany, and it continues across the continent. She takes a trip to France, and then she goes to England to make a silent film there. And you can see that all of the media is just obsessed with her. She's, you know, here's a photograph of her in London going to Limehouse, which is a Chinese district. She's modeling Chinese shawls and silk pajama sets. So she's really setting the culture, the trends. People want to dress like her. They want to cut their hair like her, have bangs like her. All of these artists and photographers are lining up to capture her image, right? Everyone wants her to sit for them for a portrait, and she's on the cover of all these different magazines. So she has this incredible run, and you know, she's super triumphant. She stays in Europe for almost 3 years, and word eventually does get back to Hollywood. So by the time she comes back to New York 3 years later, she had planned to go straight back to Hollywood. She hasn't seen her family in 3 years. But as she's getting off the boat in New York, she's accosted by a Broadway producer. They're just about to put on this Chicago gangsterland play called On the Spot, and the gangster has a Chinese girlfriend, and they want her to play the role. So she's literally going through customs, and they're like, well, will you sign on to do this? And she says yes. The play is going to open in 2 weeks, so she has 2 weeks to learn her part. It opens on Broadway, becomes a huge hit. She ends up staying in New York for the next 6 months, even tours the play across the country. So she has this really triumphant return. She's on Broadway. So by the time she gets back to Hollywood, Paramount finally is ready to give her a 2-picture deal. And the first of those pictures is going to be a starring vehicle, but it's called Daughter of the Dragon. And they do bring Sasu Hayakawa back over to co-star in it with her, along with Warner Oland, who is a Swedish actor who's going to play her father, who is Fu Manchu. So it's a Fu Manchu flick. So you can kind of see the limitations of Hollywood's, imagination, right? They couldn't see her in anything other than a Fu Manchu story. So they give her this role, and they spend a lot of money on it. Her costumes are incredible. I mean, she has so many of them. It's worth watching alone just for the wardrobe changes. But it is a really lurid, terrible story. I mean, she's the daughter of Fu Manchu, and she lusts after blood and is supposed to avenge her father. So that's the kind of story it is. And of course, it doesn't really do that well at the box office because that's the kind of thing for kids, really. It's a fantasy. So, they're not impressed. They think, we've given you this chance to prove yourself as a star, and the film doesn't do well, but they don't take accountability for the fact of the kind of story that they've put her in. In any case, here's also, a publicity still from the film that I should mention, and she signs it "Orientally Yours." That was a little thing that Anna May Wong would do, a little wink at people. She understood that being Asian was what made her different, and it was a selling point. And actually, she says, in my wardrobe, I always try to have some kind of Asian element be a part of it because it's good for business. And so after this point, she's in one other film, Shanghai Express, which is a really great film, but it's with Marlene Dietrich, and Marlene Dietrich is the star, not her. And previously, they had met in Berlin when no one knew who Marlene Dietrich was. So the tables have kind of turned. Anna May Wong was previously the more famous one, and now it's Marlene, and she's playing second fiddle to her. It's a great film, but after that film, Paramount does not renew her contract. And so 1932 is a really difficult year for her. Ironically, there's a lot of interest in China because there's some things going on between China and Japan at that time. And basically all the films become like ripped from the headline type stories. So there's all of these China-themed films in production. But in the end, she ends up not getting a role in any of them. A lot of the parts go to white actresses who play the parts in Yellow Vase. And she writes here in a letter to her friend Carl Van Vechten about one of them, I made a test at MGM Studios for the leading role in Son Daughter. But I guess I look too Chinese to play a Chinese because I hear Colleen Moore is going to do it. In the end, it's actually Helen Hayes, who's pictured here, and then that's Anna May's friend, Ramon Navarro, the Mexican-American actor. And actually, they even had Anna May go onto set and say that they looked like a perfectly Chinese couple. Can you imagine that she had to do that to help her friend with publicity for the film? Around this time, as I mentioned, there's a lot of interest in China. A really important book comes up, probably many of you have heard of or read, The Good Earth, which was written by Pearl Buck, who's the daughter of American missionaries in China. She grows up in China, she's fluent in Chinese, understands the culture, at least from a rural perspective, and she writes this very humanistic, sympathetic portrait of two Chinese farmers, Wong and Olan, and it becomes an instant bestseller in the US. Probably 1 out of 4 Americans had read it within the year that it came out. She wins the Pulitzer Prize, so it's a huge book. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about it is that all these Americans read it and they're like, wow, I read this book and it doesn't even seem like they're Chinese. It's so relatable. And, so it just gives you a sense of like where we were in our culture at that time. But Irving Thalberg, who's the boy genius at MGM, sees this and he decides that he's going to be the one to adapt it into an epic film. He buys the rights for, I think, $50,000, which was like the largest amount of money at the time spent on rights. So here we have a film that's finally a sympathetic portrait of the Chinese with a leading lady role opposite another Chinese character. So you would think this is the perfect opportunity for Anna May Wong. And so many people in the media who were her friends too are starting to say this in their, who do you think they're going to cast for? Well, shouldn't it be Anna May Wong? Who else would it be? And just remind you of her quote, right? Someday, someone will write a story demanding a real Chinese girl. So here we have that opportunity finally. Of course, that's not what happens. They cast Paul Muni as the lead, as Wong Lung, and they use that as an excuse to say, well, we have a white actor playing the male lead, so we can't have an Asian actor opposite him because that would be interracial and you have to kiss and be married. It's very strange logic because he's playing a Chinese, right? It doesn't make sense. So then they cast Louise Reiner, who's also German. She's just arrived from Germany. She's actually still learning English, but that's perfectly fine, supposedly, for this role. So they've got two white actors playing the leads in Yellowface. But at the same time, Irving Thalberg understands that the book was successful because it was so relatable and also accurate and authentic. And so he is claiming that he wants to do this really authentic picture about China. They've spent years on pre-production. They've sent all these scouts to China. They've collected so many different types of materials. They bought up farms wholesale and shipped them back to Hollywood. They studied the hair, the dress, all of these details down to the smallest thing, and they want it to be accurate. But at the same time, they can't bring themselves to cast Asian actors, Chinese actors, in the principal roles. And they go up and down the West Coast trying to cast people from Chinatowns, and they keep saying, well, either their English is not good enough or they're too Americanized and they don't look Chinese enough. So here we have on the far right, we have an ad for Max Factor makeup that's bragging about how realistic their yellow face is because they don't want it to be like the schlocky Fu Manchu yellow face. They want it, again, to seem authentic. So you can kind of see the deep hypocrisies here around the good earth. And they do ultimately ask Anna May to audition for a secondary role, which is kind of the tea house girl who then becomes the concubine, the second wife. And what I discovered in my research is that in the end, they didn't even offer her that role. They offered her an even smaller role, the kind of lady in waiting to the second wife. But what she says publicly is that they offered me this Lotus role and I'm not going to take it. And so she says very publicly, I'm not going to be in this film. And what she decides to do next, I think, is really brilliant. She says, I'm going on my first trip to China. And if she doesn't say this outright, but I feel like with her actions, she's saying, if you want to know what China is really like, you can come with me. And so she produces this counter-narrative of her entire trip to China. We see her here on the far left, arriving in Shanghai. And she's mobbed by press and fans. She writes a 5-part series of essays about her first impressions in China for the New York Herald Tribune, which is then syndicated across the country. She also brings a cameraman, his name's Newsreel Wong, and he documents a lot of her travels, which she later makes into a documentary that she narrates. So she's producing all this, counter media around her travels. So you can see her China versus the Hollywood manufactured China. So we see her here in a moon gate in Beijing, and she really loved the architecture and the walled gardens that were there in the city. So later when she builds her own home in Santa Monica, she builds a moon gate into the garden and she names the house Moon Gate. I also really love the photo in the far bottom right corner. It's of her going out into the farmland, rural areas, and speaking with some actual farmers. So you can see some Chinese farmers, like some real ones rather than the ones in the good earth. But this trip really changes her. It's like one of the most meaningful things that she did in her life. And while she was in China, she did experience actually a lot of criticism. As much as people were excited to see her, they had a lot of things to say about the films that she had been in, many of which had been banned in China. And they complained to her, why did you represent us in this way? People see this and they think all Asian women or all Asian people are like this. And we're mad at you. Why didn't you say no? And of course they don't completely understand the situation that she's in, right? She tries to explain to them, well, I didn't really have a say over the roles that I took. I could take the roles or not, and then I wouldn't have a career, right? You wouldn't see me at all. But despite this, she, knowing, they don't totally understand her situation, she does take a lot of their criticism to heart. So when she comes back to the US, she says very publicly, Hollywood won't cast Chinese actors in Chinese roles. And to me, that's her way of saying Hollywood is racist, which I think was a really brave thing for her to do, because it wasn't like there were other people saying this type of thing in the 1930s. So she says that, and she also says, I'm not going to play any more unsympathetic roles. But the really genius thing that she does is that while she was in China, she runs into her friend Warner Oland, the Swedish actor who now has become famous for playing Charlie Chan. And she sees in China that everyone loves him because they love Charlie Chan. So they completely embrace him. They're telling him, you look like a real Chinese. You could just be like a normal Chinese. Meanwhile, all the newspapers are criticizing her because she looks old and they don't like her clothes and she doesn't know anything about Chinese history and she should be deported. So they give her a really difficult time, but she sees the way they embrace him. So she goes home and she has this idea. So she goes to Paramount, has lunch with an executive, and she says, I've got this idea to play a female version of Charlie Chan. Who do you think I should pitch it to? And of course, the executive immediately says, well, why aren't you pitching it to us? And so she uses that idea to get a new series of films at Paramount in the late 1930s. And the first of those is called Daughter of Shanghai. And, granted, these are all B movies, so like a 1 hour runtime, lower budgets, but they're her projects. Before they get titles, it's titled Anime Wong Project, right? So she really has a lot of influence over how the stories are written. And so Daughter of Shanghai is, kind of a revolutionary film for 1937. It's her and Philip Ahn, who's a Korean American actor who is also her childhood friend. They play the heroes of this film, and he's actually playing an FBI agent, which someone mentioned to me predates an actual Asian American becoming an FBI agent by probably a couple decades. So truly visionary. All the villains are played by white actors. And it's a great film. I definitely suggest watching it. And instead of, like her early films where she gets killed off, she gets a happy ending. And she and Philip Ahn, are in the back of the car at the end of the film, and he's asking her to marry him. And part of that dialogue is in Cantonese with no subtitles. So can you imagine, 1937, who else was doing that? No one. So that's the first of the series of films she makes. Another one I really like is King of Chinatown, where she plays, it's a fictional biopic of Dr. Margaret Chung, who was based here actually in San Francisco, was the first Chinese American woman to become a doctor. And so she plays a surgeon in the film, and it has these really lovely slices of life from Chinatown, where her dad runs a traditional herbal shop. So she's the modern surgeon and he's the old school. And so you kind of see the difference between the generations. She invites her colleagues from the hospital home for Chinese New Year dinner. So there's a lot of little things like that that are really beautiful and touching. Again, 1939, quite revolutionary. And I did want to just mention, because Indra had asked me about this, so after this period, it becomes World War II. So she actually throws herself into a lot of the war efforts, fundraising for China Aid. And one of the things I recently discovered that I wrote about in my newsletter is that there was actually this great moment where the NAACP held a really large fundraiser for China Aid in Los Angeles. And it had the most famous Black stars there: Hattie McDaniel, Ethel Waters, Billie Holiday, Nicholas Brothers, an incredible group of entertainers. And Anime Wong was also there to be a part of that moment. So I thought it was a really beautiful example of Black-Asian solidarity, which you can read more about in my newsletter, and maybe we'll talk a little more about it later. But yeah, just to kind of summarize, there's so much more that happens in Anime Wong's career, but this is a kind of brief overview. And this photo actually is taken from the 1950s and 1951. She gets her own television show called The Gallery of Madame Liaosong. It's about a woman who runs an art gallery and then starts solving art crimes and travels the world. Unfortunately, the tapes are lost, but it made her the first Asian American to lead a television show. That was very early on in the television era. So that's another groundbreaking thing that she did. But just to kind of summarize, first American-born woman of color to play a leading role in a Hollywood production, first Chinese-American movie star. She was possibly cinema's first interracial kiss. I'm not totally sure on this, but I haven't found one that's earlier. But she was in a British film called Java Head, where she kisses her British co-star. And then with Philip Ahn in Daughter of Shanghai, they become the first Asian American actors to play a leading romantic couple in the sound era. And then, as I mentioned, first Asian American to lead a television show. So that is Anna May Wong's life and career. Thank you so much.
I'm sure this is a big question, but can you speak a little bit to your research?
Sure, like where I
Yeah.
got the research,
Yes,
where I did the research.
Sources, yeah, maybe sources.
Sure. Well, so of course there have been other books written before mine about Anna May Wong, so that was a good starting place for me. But a lot of the materials, I mean, newspapers, a ton of newspaper material. A lot of it is newspaper material if you want to know where she was and what she was doing. There's a lot of great interviews and things that she did either with newspapers or with some of the movie magazines from the 1920s and 30s, which is a great source, and those are all digitized and online. She also, as I mentioned, she wrote a number of pieces herself, some about her own life, and her interviews also read as if she wrote them. She had a very distinctive voice, also like a writerly sensibility, which is unlike a lot of other Hollywood stars at the time, who were kind of vapid. But she was, even though she didn't graduate high school, she was a reader. She loved to read books. So that's why people always, like, in all these intellectual circles, I mean, Walter Benjamin, like, writes about meeting her in Germany and how smitten he was. I mean, this is a German philosopher, so, she really impressed people. But other sources, I mean, so many different archives I went to. The New York Public Library has a collection of her playbills, her personal collection, which is interesting because you can see which shows she went to in different countries, and sometimes she'd go backstage and get autographs from people, or if they were her friends. I went down to Los Angeles and was at the Academy Library for about a month, going through just production files for all of her films, and even films, like The Good Earth that she wasn't in. Actually, Berkeley here has a collection of Chinese movie magazines, so I went through those. I also went to the British Film Institute because they have original prints of her European films, and up until very recently, there was no way to watch those unless you went to the archive. So I went and did that. But there's just an enormous amount of, I mean, for someone who didn't leave personal papers, never wrote a memoir, there's actually quite an enormous amount of material just from all of the media surrounding her. And then, importantly, some correspondence that we do have is between her and her friend, Carl Van Vechten, and a few others, and that's at the Yale Beinecke Library.
Could you tell us something about, I think your last slide was her in 1950s? Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about her later life and what was it like for her?
Sure.
Because in Hollywood, you get old after 30, so you figure what was it like for her and what were her later years like?
Mm-hmm. It was certainly difficult. I mean, Anna May Wong is part of kind of a first class of Hollywood stars who'd never gone through this before. I mean, you didn't have celebrities like that before film. And she started in the silence and, saw all of these changes. And, as she aged, it became increasingly more difficult for a Chinese American actress to get work because now she was no longer the attractive, exotic ingenue. She was old, by Hollywood's standards. And, her health wasn't the greatest. She did have cirrhosis of the liver. So she was drinking a lot in her later years. I mean, you have to put it in perspective, too. Everyone in Hollywood was drinking a lot during that time. And people smoked, and a lot of people died pretty early in their 40s. So, she had health issues, so she did age quite a bit during that time. She made some propaganda films in the 1940s that for the war effort, and she donated those proceeds. But she didn't work much that decade. She had one other film that she made at the end of the 1940s, and then she really dove into TV because it was an opportunity, because other Hollywood stars who were still working in films, they didn't want to be in TV. It wasn't seen as prestigious. So she saw it as an opportunity, and she did that one show early on in 1951. It wasn't a big success. It was made by Dumont Television, which was a kind of like budget rate, one channel. I forgetting my words, but anyways, they actually went out of business, which is why we don't have the tapes to that. But supposedly the production value was very low. So she, that was definitely a blow to her that didn't go well. So it took her a few years to really gather herself again. And so by 1956, she starts doing a lot of television, and she's essentially transitioned to being a character actor. So she's playing usually older Chinese women. She's in an episode of White Earp where she's playing kind of an elder in this Western town. So she did a lot of work. I mean, sometimes she's playing maids too, servants. And that's actually her last role in Portrait in Black in 1960. That was like kind of her film comeback. And then she was that same producer was going to do Flower Drum Song. So she was meant to be in Flower Drum Song, and she died, unfortunately, a week before rehearsals started. But, I like to think about it from her perspective. She was really happy. She was so excited to be a part of that. And it's unlucky for us that we don't get to see her in that film. I think there had been a question. Oh, okay.
Hi. So you had mentioned that she went to Germany with her sister Lulu for her chaperone for 3 years, but you don't really mention much about her family and whether or not they embraced her career.
Yeah, well, it's definitely in the book.
Okay.
But yes, that's a great question because her parents were not super supportive in the beginning. I mean, they never really super supportive, let's just be honest. But at the time that she started working in films, nobody really understood what the film industry was. It was like TikTok. They thought, this is stupid, it's gonna go away, it won't last. And the people who were in it really believed in it. It was an art form. So no parent wanted their child working in Hollywood, because the most people who did it were working class and needed to make money for their family. That's why they did it. So on the one hand, they didn't like her going and doing these jobs. They didn't understand it. She's wearing skimpy outfits. They can't monitor her. She's around men, who knows what's going on. But then she comes home with these big fat checks, and she's helping the family out. She actually sends all of her brothers to college. She pays for a lot of things. She buys property. So her dad doesn't want to say no to those things. So it's kind of this thing that's always constantly being negotiated between the two of them. And in the 1920s, she kind of moves in and out of the laundry because they're having arguments. They want her to get married, and she needs to marry a Chinese guy. Meanwhile, she's having relationships with white guys. And at a certain point, her father, they had a love-hate relationship. She really deeply loved him and respected him, but they would butt heads. And at a certain point, he says, look, Anna Mae, if I will build this bungalow for you in the back of the laundry's lot, a place that you can have all to your own if you will just come home. And so she does that until she leaves for Europe.
Hello. I was able to listen to one of your podcasts about the interview, and it was also mentioned that she was able to speak a number of languages. Can you kind of elaborate? Did she do any film in other languages, or just conversation, or how deep are those languages that she spoke?
That's a great question, and she did do some films in other languages, which I haven't seen those versions of it, but essentially when she went to Germany, and she was working there, she realized that everyone in the cast and crew were carrying these little books, and she asked, what is that? And it was an English to German dictionary. And she said, well, this would be a lot easier if just one person learned German rather than all of you learning English. So she decided to learn German and supposedly was fluent in it. And so when she makes her first talkie film, she actually makes it in Europe. And at the time, because sound films were so new, they didn't have overdubbing and that kind of technology, so you just had to make it multiple times in different languages. So she made a film called The Flame of Love, or Hai Tang. It has many titles because it's in all these different languages, but she made it 3 times. So she made it first in England in English, and then she made it in France with a different cast in French, and she had French lessons for quite a while to do that, and then she made it in German with a German cast. And supposedly the the critics in Germany, they couldn't believe it. They said it was uncanny. It couldn't be her because her German was too good. But I myself haven't watched them, so I haven't heard her. It's a great question because I don't actually know what she sounds like in those other languages. And then of course she spoke some Toisanese. Her family is from Toisan in southern China, so she spoke some of that. But my understanding is it is a very broken version of that. And then when she was in China, she took Mandarin lessons. So she learned Mandarin, and she did use it occasionally in various films after that.
Quick question. I was wondering why she never went back to Broadway.
Why she didn't go back to Broadway?
Or maybe she did and you didn't mention it.
Yeah, she only had that one Broadway run. I mean, I think she didn't get the offer, the opportunity to do it. Yeah. There was a question over here. Oh. Okay, well.
Okay. You did mention Broadway and Flower Drum Song. So would she have a trend of singing or dancing?
So she did do some training in dancing because very often a lot of the films wanted her to be a dancer, an exotic dancer. I would say she's not really the best dancer. That's not really her forte, but she did do it in a number of films. And she did have training to do it. Singing, she does, so the sound film I just mentioned, she does actually sing in that film. And I think you can find, if you can't find the film itself, I think there's a recording of her singing that's on YouTube from that film. I don't know if she had training for that, but it's possible.
Okay, when you said Flower Drum Song, is that a Broadway version or the movie version?
The movie. She was
The
supposed to be
movie.
in the movie.
Okay. I suppose it would be Madame Wong.
Madame Liang.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
She's the
The
one
chops. She was supposed to do the chop suey number.
she ordered a dozen of 1,000-year eggs to make sure they're fresh. I remember that line really well.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Dr. Harvey Dong for the Eastwind Books supply. I wanted to ask you, not to put you on the spot, but was there a favorite chapter when you were writing this?
A favorite chapter when I was writing the book?
Correct.
That's a good question. Favorite chapter? I mean, I think the first chapter I wrote was, I think it's chapter 6 or chapter 5 or 6. It's called The Girl Who Can't Help Being Chinese, and it's about her time in England making a film called Piccadilly. And that was a lot of fun to write, and that was it helped me figure out how to write the rest of the book. So I think probably that's maybe one of the chapters I think about a lot.
I actually wanted to ask a question. I'm sorry, I came from a funeral in San Francisco, so I didn't get to hear much of your talk, but I watched your TED Talk, and I was really impressed with the interviews you did with the workers in these Chinese restaurants. And you said once you were able to speak to them in Mandarin, then they were able to share a lot of their experiences. I'm just wondering, how did you speak Mandarin as a child, or did you learn it later in life, or?
No, I learned Mandarin in college. I studied it as a minor. I'm a little rusty, so I will put that out there. But my family is Cantonese, and also from the same place as Anna May Wong's family. So my grandma speaks Toisanese, this dialect of Cantonese. So I mean, technically I should speak Cantonese, but it's a lot harder to learn. I've tried.
Hi, Katie. I had a question. Now that your amazing book, which I've absolutely loved reading, is out in the world, what are women in Hollywood who are Asian? What is their response?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I haven't heard from that many, but I do think in general when I hear from Asian women, whether or not they're working in Hollywood, they feel a lot of similarities to Anna May Wong's life. Like, wow, like this stuff is still happening. Like what happened to her feels like what's happening to me. I think it's kind of sadly a universal experience for Asian American women. So, and I think that's also why I was drawn to her story, because I saw a lot of my own mother's life in her, the kind of rebellion against being super Chinese and wanting to be, American. And in her time, that meant being a flapper, right? But then also she kind of goes back and forth, right? Because she's, at the same time that she wants to be this flapper, she's also trying to understand what it means to be Chinese, because we don't know. We were born here. We've never been to China. We don't necessarily speak the language. If you're familiar with, probably a lot of you are familiar with the photographer Corky Lee, rest in peace, but one of the things he used to say is that he was a 100% authentic fake. And I just always think about that phrase because that's what it feels like. And so, while she was on the set of Thief of Baghdad, she was carrying around a copy of Confucius's Analects to, and that was, I think, her way of trying to understand what it means to be Chinese. Of course, I don't know if that actually helped her, but I think that there's just so much that's still really relevant to a lot of us.
Thank you so much. Some Oakland love for Katie. Thank you for coming here from Brooklyn.